grief, like you mentioned, is incredibly unique to the individual. So there really is no time limit. There's no right or wrong way to do it. And we acknowledge that all the time throughout our work. And I think what we have come to learn, which I think is felt across the board, is that it is a lifelong process.
Mm-hmm.
So we always come back to that. And it was interesting. I saw someone the other week who I hadn't seen for quite some time, I think even maybe before my mum had died. And so Sal's just passed the 2-year mark and I'm coming up to the 2-year mark. So in our eyes, it's still very fresh.
Yeah.
And this person didn't even acknowledge that my mum had died and I hadn't seen them. And it's kind of like, because it's been nearly 2 years, I think in their mind, it's like, oh, don't need to bring it up.
Yeah.
But it's still such a huge part of my world.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. And I think that's what we always come back to is like, grief is lifelong. It changes over time. Nobody is going to grieve the same way as you, but there are a lot of similarities in the way that people grieve. You know, Sal and I, our mums died from different circumstances, but we feel so many of the same things, you know, and at different times as well. You know, it'll hit you at different times, but yeah, it's a funny old thing, grief.
Yeah. What advice would you give to people that are feeling really isolated in their grief? Again, we talked about COVID and how isolating that was for people just in general. The podcast has been a great way to reach out to people in every country really across the world. But is there something that has worked for you guys that if it happened again tomorrow, that would be the first thing that you would go to?
For me, grief is so lonely, and I think that loneliness can come not necessarily from not having people around you, but it comes from having that lack of connection with people who understand what you're going through. And I think that's why so many people do feel lonely and isolated in their grief, even if they've got a massive support network. It's having that kind of connection with someone that really gets what you're going through, which is why Im and I connected on such a level. But I do think sometimes you need to help people help you in a way, because I think people are rubbish.
Yes.
They're shit. They don't know how to support you.
Yes.
And, you know, like Im's example earlier, they might not even acknowledge it because they are just so uncomfortable with talking about death. You know, I think it makes us face our own mortality. That's why people are just rubbish with it. But also they just don't know how to support. So I do think in a way, and one thing that I've learned is almost letting people know what you need if you've got the strength to do that, and not necessarily just going, okay, well, they haven't, you know, my friends haven't shown up for me in the way that I'd like them to, so I'm going to put them in that box of they're rubbish. I think it's almost, you need to let them know what you need as well, and kind of help people help you if you can, because, you know, support is so important.
And that can be really hard. To even
so
say,
hard.
You know, it's hard to even help yourself, let alone to be able to tell somebody else how they can help you. But I think even just letting people know that of like, hey, it might be really hard for you to dig into that part of yourself and ask for help right now, but I promise you it's going to be worth it once you do. That's something that I have people come and ask me a lot about wedding planning, because my dad and my mother-in-law both passed away before our wedding. So my husband and I were both going through this and it was pretty difficult. So people come to me all the time to ask for advice and how do you deal with this? And that's one of those times where it's a pleasant event, right? People are thrilled to be involved and they want to help. And I have to tell the people, take advantage of that. You know, maybe those people weren't there when you were grieving because they don't know what to say. But in this wedding planning time, they want to help you. Take advantage of the help as much as you can and assign them to do certain tasks, assign them to do the envelopes for the invitations or get some flowers or whatever it need be, because you just can't do it all. You really can't.
And I think there's power in sort of letting people know that you need them in a way, like, hey, I just want to let you know, I'm really struggling with my grief, but I really appreciate your friendship. And just kind of reaching out. It doesn't have to be, you know, like, hey, I need you to do this for me, but it's just more like just trying to keep those connections if you can, because sometimes people might not realize how much you need them, and you kind of sometimes have to educate people on how to help you. But yeah, like you say, like, it's moments like that where you've got to hold on to the help when you can.
Yeah. And Sal, you mentioned something in a recent podcast of yours about if you do check in on the person, saying no need to respond at the end of the message. That was huge for me. And I do have one person in mind that did that for me. And that is like something I will never forget how it made me feel. So it's something that I've turned into. I do it to people that I'm checking in on with grief, or just like, hope you're having a great day, love you. And that's it.
It's amazing, isn't it? And because it's so overwhelming, in the first weeks, months, even years, it's so much to try and think of what to say back other than I'm doing shit, So there's
and
so
your
much
phone is
power in
often
that.
blowing up as well, isn't it? Like so many people are bombarding you in the first couple of weeks, and then after that it's crickets. But it helps so much to just take that pressure off.
Yeah.
I think.
Absolutely. So I want to hear from each of you. What is something that you've heard from a guest that you've had on the show that has almost shook you to the core? Whether it was super surprising about their story or made you look at your own story in a completely different way?
Ooh,
For me,
many, haven't they?
Yeah, so many. But for me personally, I don't really have to think too hard about this one. We had the absolute honor of speaking with Dr. Edith Eger, who is a 94-year-old Holocaust survivor.
Yes.
And she teaches people about the gift of forgiveness. And we had her on the podcast, and it was honestly one of those pinch me moments where we're like, how is this happening right now? She was my absolute like hero in my healing. And so my mum died by suicide, and with suicide loss, it can bring up a lot of complicated emotions like guilt and rage and all of these, really, yucky emotions. And the circumstances surrounding what happened to my mum made things kind of extra complicated for me. And I was just filled with a lot of rage. And Dr. Edith Eger talks about how important it is to like feel those feelings and also find forgiveness, and how healing forgiveness is. And I had no idea what forgiveness was going into this. I'm like, you forgive someone, you just let them off the hook and, get on with your life. But it's so much more than that. It's a gift that you give to yourself to heal yourself, because you don't want to hold on to those emotions for the rest of your life. And I was like, they were eating me alive. I don't know if any of your listeners are going through the same thing, but like rage and hatred and fear and all of those emotions like physically affect you. And I was just struggling so badly. So I was able to kind of really process those emotions from speaking to this incredible woman and hearing all of her wisdom. And I feel like, she changed my life. And I could go on and on about it, but she is hands down mine.
I am immediately thinking of people that I will need to send this episode to because of this in particular. The forgiveness is absolutely huge. And you're right. You don't look at it in a space of forgiving who. I don't need to forgive somebody. No, forgiving yourself is where really all that power comes from. So that is amazing. I did listen to some of that episode, but I can see how for a situation with suicide, that would have been incredibly empowering to be able to look at it that way.
Yeah, it was life-changing. And it applies to anyone who's experienced any sort of trauma as well. Just finding forgiveness, because when you're holding on to those emotions, like it's just affecting you and your quality of life. So it's just so important to process them. And there is a place for feeling all of those things. Like you need to feel it to move through it, but don't get stuck in it. And that's everything that she teaches. And I would, recommend anyone to look her up, Dr. Edith Eger. She's got 2 incredible books as well, which are just life-changing.
Thanks for sharing that.
I think for me, that to be honest, I don't know which one to pick because we've interviewed so many amazing guests, but there's an American author called Hope Edelman. I don't know if you've heard of her.
Motherless Daughters, right?
Yes. Yeah. She wrote the book Motherless Daughters, and she's written many books. That's one of her most famous ones. And she's also written a book called The After Grief, which kind of looks at how after that initial, period of loss, how we then go on to live with grief in our lives. And she said something that really struck a chord with me, because I think when we are grieving, there's this expectation from society that we get over it, or there's some closure or acceptance, which, as we know, isn't the case. You know, you learn to live with the loss, but there's no getting over it or like, oh, I'm healed now. And she said that there's this cultural imperative to have closure, or, you know, a resolution to your loss, or some kind of acceptance. And that she, in her mind, you can have maybe a feeling of acceptance at a certain point, but it's more like a train station that you arrive and depart from, and it's kind of like a hub, and there's never the sort of finality of acceptance, but it's more, you might have phases where you feel it, but then something might happen, like you have an experience, a life experience, like becoming a mother for the first time, getting married, you know, something like that, a big life experience that might then evoke your grief or your feelings, memories of that person, and you may grieve them all over again. And that really struck a chord with me, because I thought it was a really poignant way to explain and describe the feelings of grief over time.
Yeah, that was really interesting, wasn't it, Sal? And I remember she was saying how when she had her first daughter, I think she was about 33. So her mum died when she was in her teens, but she grieved for her mum all over again when she became a mum herself. So yeah, she just, the idea of there being closure or this final acceptance and you move on with your life is really not what it is. And I think, yeah, that really helped us, didn't it?
And I know for you, Gianna, your daughter's just turned 1. So I don't know whether that, you know, rings true for you as well.
So for the second time of me ever doing this podcast, I have now started to tear up because you are reminding me that was that episode of yours that I listened to that struck me to the core. It was, I think, this summer that you put it out, or at least that I had found it this summer and listened to it. And Hope Edelman had talked about Motherless Mothers, I think was another book that she had written based on that, and grieving her mother differently after the birth of her child. And I'm sitting there with a 6-7 month old at the time. I have nothing that I could complain about in my life. And I was so depressed. I would walk into the kitchen in the morning and I would just start shaking. I would start crying. I couldn't physically know how to make a cup of coffee. I think in that episode made me realize, like, hello, this is grief again. You know, you get to a point where you think that you're past it, or that can't possibly be what this is. It's very sneaky in how it rears its head sometimes. It got to the point where after that episode was able to put words to it, and I said to my husband, I think I'm so happy that I'm sad. I am so in love with this little baby that I am so sad my dad is not here to see this and see her and see this person, that I've become with her. And I think that was also really scary too, because I do feel, you know, it's very interesting for me to be able to have the opportunity to speak with you, because I don't often speak with people who've had a loss after me. You get to a point where you're so happy for your grief. As so weird as that sounds, like, I am happy that I think about him all the time. Whereas in the earlier years, I would have given anything for that to stop because of how painful it was. But eventually it's not that painful. And it's like the most beautiful thing to feel that I have his memory with me all the time.
Yes.
But at the same time, I realized I can think that I'm over it. I can think that and over it's not the term. I can think that I've figured out the ways to conquer this and to have all my emotions at bay. But just as I will keep evolving as a person, so too will my grief. And I will have it in different ways for the rest of my life. And that is beautiful and terrifying at the same time.
Yes. And that's the thing, is bringing it back to Dr. Edith Eger as well. She says, like, grief, it's not something that we're going to overcome. It's not something that we've got to get over. It's just something that we come to terms with as a part of us.
Yeah.
And, you know, we move forward with our life, and it'll always be there. And some days it'll feel really raw. And some days, like you said, we'll find appreciation for our grief and be like, it's here for the ride, but it reminds us of our loved one. And how beautiful is that? It's so important, I think, for people to kind of let go of that misconception of that we have to get over it, because it's not possible.
Yeah. It's not possible. And I don't even want that to happen. Like, what does that look like? You know, I guess it's if you were presented with the option to never feel pain again, but you would forget them, like I would never choose that.
No, not at all. And you know, grief at its core, it's love, right? And we still love them. They're always in our hearts and minds. So of course we're always going to be thinking of them and always going to be carrying them with us. It's just how it evolves over time. And it's a funny one, isn't it? Some days you feel, or weeks or months, you feel really strong, and then something will hit you, or a memory, or you know, it's an oscillate. It just oscillates, doesn't it? Grief. And I think that's what really resonated with me with Hope, the conversation with Hope, and I'm so glad that it resonated with you as well, is the fact that it's okay to come in and out of your grief, you know, like a train station, you arrive and you depart. And I think just understanding, because I think we can judge ourselves, can't we, in our grief? We can be like, oh, you know, I haven't felt anything for a few weeks. I've had a strong few weeks and I haven't really, you know, felt any sort of pain around them. Am I not doing it right? Or, you know, we can judge ourselves if we feel like we're grieving too hard still. And it's, I think just letting go of any judgment on yourself and just knowing that it's a process, a long process.
I feel like that was a sneak attack. Like I completely forgot that I even had that experience with that episode. So if you had any doubt that you were reaching your audience and really changing our lives, I hope that clears it up that I just cried right in front of you in the middle of the interview.
You made me cry too. I'm so
goodness.
so glad that you took that away from that episode.